The report also points out that the role of individuals and communities is very important. So what each of us do as individuals with our neighbors, church, school, communities in general is going to be very important to achieve 1.5. So right now it's not the point to say, oh, it's up to governments and my government doesn't do anything, or the state or the utility company or whatever. Right now we're really talking about collective action. And I think it's also very important to note that each and every one of us has an important role to play.
Hello and welcome to the Great Climate Debate Podcast. I'm Jeffrey DeSena. In episode 3, I spent a significant amount of time discussing the highlights of the most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. The IPCC had commissioned a special report, the first one of its kind, at the request of the signatories of the Paris Climate Agreement from 2015, to examine the effects of and possibility of getting to a scenario in which global mean surface temperatures remain below 1.5 degrees C, warmer than they were in the second half of the 19th century. Recently, I had the honor of connecting with one of the lead authors on that report. Debora Ley is a lead author on the 2018 IPCC Special Report on 1.5 degrees C warming, or SR 1.5. Debbie has worked on renewable energy, rural electrification, and climate change since 2002, implementing and managing programs for USAID, US DOE in Central America, and UN ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as carrying out evaluations for the International Development Bank and World Bank. She recently worked as a clean energy specialist for EcoDit, a consultancy with the mission of advancing responsible use of energy and natural resources with projects around the world. She worked on the CEFCA project, which is the Clean Energy Finance Facility for the Caribbean and Central America, a USAID-funded program that provides the financial resources to expand renewable energy in Central America. Debbie also serves in a variety of distinguished volunteer roles, like her position with the IPCC. She is also an editor for both Sense and Sustainability and the academic journal Regional Environmental Change. She is a member of the Scientific Council for Latinoamérica Renovable, whom she represented at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change's Conference of Parties, or COP, each year since 2014. And she is a professional partner of Engineers Without Borders, Johns Hopkins chapter, where she leads the planning, design, and implementation of a solar water pumping project in the highlands of Guatemala. She received her PhD from Oxford University, where she studied the conditions necessary for climate change adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development in Latin America, specifically in Guatemala and Nicaragua. Debbie is originally from Mexico City, but returned to a quiet town in Guatemala closer to the centers of indigenous knowledge. That was a term that I was not familiar with before reading the most recent IPCC special report, but I had a chance to ask Debbie about indigenous knowledge and a whole swath of other details. She was only able to spare about an hour of her busy schedule, but I'm grateful for every minute. I could have asked another 3 hours worth of questions. The situation is complex, to say the least, and the rampant oversimplification of the report's findings may be a major contributor to the confusion surrounding climate change. We spoke briefly about how there are positive changes as a result of climate change, but they are still changes and we will need to adapt to them. Debbie reiterates many times during our conversation the triple objective of mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development. At this point, we can't stop climate change. We can mitigate the effects, but we will need to adapt, and that adaptation is taking place in the context of continuing to develop our human communities into places conducive to human flourishing. Spoken like a true scientist, Debbie seems to be taking a very objective and focused approach to solving the problem. Possibly the most interesting and most important part of the discussion was the responsibility of each of us in tackling this challenge. The way Debbie spoke of the responsibility of every individual seemed to bridge a divide that I had noticed in the political rhetoric. Her view is not individualist nor collectivist, it's both. Individuals, collectively, must act if the future imagined by the IPCC is to come to fruition. But I'll let Debbie explain further. She is far more knowledgeable than I am about basically everything in this space, so I'll stop rambling. I bring you Debbie Ley. Debbie, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you for your very kind invitation.
Well, it was great that we finally were able to connect. I know we first made connection while you were deeply embroiled in the IPCC report drafting process. So glad you had a little bit of time to settle down now. Are things a little quieter now that you've finished up the first draft in Incheon?
Yeah, well, we actually didn't finish the first draft in Korea. It's finally gotten approved, but we're all very excited that it's finally out, even though there are some very concerning results. But we are busy right now with outreach activities and trying to share and explain the main results with a variety of public. And also, well, as you know, this report is going to be used for the COP24 in Poland in December. So we also want to make sure it's out there and people are aware of it and can actually use it as an input.
Yeah, definitely. And I will continue to spread the word on my end. I've been chugging my way through it, and it's not exactly hopeful, but it certainly is interesting. So people will have gotten a little bit of background on who you are and what you've been working on, but I think we'd like to hear your version of the story. What projects are you working on now, and how did you end up in Guatemala?
Yeah, so I studied engineering. My dad was also a renewable energy engineer working in rural communities. And I kind of also wanted to do that. And more on a more personal side, I'm a very big fan of Wile E. Coyote and always enjoyed how he was drawing his blueprints in his cave and all his calculations on how to catch the bird. I think those two factors drove me to study engineering in the field of renewable energy. I started at Sandia National Labs, where I was managing the Central America program. And that's where I realized that just working on electrification as such for sustainable development was not sufficient because the region is very vulnerable to climate impacts. And of course, right now we can see it more so than back in 2002, but still we were right off Hurricane Mitch. There was still reconstruction, and then a couple years later, after I started working, came Hurricane Stan. So throughout my work, and whether it be at UN or through the different rural electrification program evaluations, I've done the component of climate change and how people and systems are vulnerable has come up, which is what led me to do my research at Oxford on can the triple objective of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development be simultaneously achieved. So I decided Guatemala and Nicaragua are two of my favorite countries in the region. And that's how I got my research developed. And that's actually one of the areas I focused on in the SR 1.5, on looking at synergies and trade-offs between both mitigation and adaptation, but also for sustainable development.
Great. That pretty much covers the whole swath of what you've been working on. Can you share a little bit more about your research originally? I mean, you were investigating if we could get that those big three, mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development. What did your research find? Were you able to create processes or find situations in which that's possible?
Yeah, so just again to go back on why I chose the topic is, well, one, while I was working, I know that we look a lot at the poverty alleviation component, which was one of the main focuses of the USA DOE programs. But also in that whenever we do renewable energy, like, small scale hydro, and there was some maintenance thing to do, or when there wasn't enough water or too much water, then the backup would automatically be diesel. So then I'm looking at, well, we do this renewable energy, but we can't entirely eliminate CO2 emissions in some cases. But also because of the recent, storms, hurricanes, that systems were vulnerable. So I started looking at, well, these systems, for example, didn't meet codes and standards of the National Electric Code. And then people actually got hurt or systems stopped working when they were most needed, like for emergency situations. So that's when I started looking at it's not enough to just meet one objective, whether it be adaptation, emissions reductions, or poverty alleviation, but that the three needed to be looked at together. And so during my field work, I did find one project that met the three conditions and other projects that a little bit more could have been done, but that in general, it is possible to do it if specific conditions are met, such as the financing, the will, that expectations between the donors and the communities are consistent. One part of my research was analyzing Elinor Ostrom's common resources principle theory, applying that to renewable energy systems. Not only looking at fisheries and forests, which is the original research of Eleanor Ostrom, but also applying that to technology. I'm happy to say that my findings did indicate that it is possible. And in some ways, it is also reflected in the IPCC 1.5, in that it is possible to achieve 1.5, both reducing emissions and adapting to it while still achieving sustainable development goals.
That absolutely will be something that will certainly be crucial as so much of the world continues to develop and will, in a way, have to leapfrog the Western world in getting past fossil fuel-based development. But you've mentioned the IPCC SR 1.5 a couple times, and that being the special report on 1.5 degrees C warming. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in that report?
Each country nominates their scientists. Each country has a focal point that connects with the IPCC. So in 2017, early in the year, I got the invitation from IPCC to be part of Chapter 4, which is the one that looks at strengthening the global response. I, of course, accepted. It was very exciting.
Great, and I noticed on there that you were shown as representing both Mexico and Guatemala, because you grew up in Mexico City, correct?
Well, I am from Mexico City, and I was nominated by the Mexican government, but Guatemala appears because it's the country where I am in right now. So some authors, the authors that in which you see have more than one country, it's usually your country of citizenship and the country in which you're based in.
What do you think it was that made them want to nominate you? Did you have to apply for this, or did someone just notice the work that you were doing and thought that you would be a good addition to the team?
It can go both ways, actually. I didn't fill paperwork out, so I was very pleased to know that I was nominated. I guess it was mainly based on my research that I had done at Oxford.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And as a primary author, what was your real responsibility? Because it seemed like there were a lot of other contributing authors on that report. What was your role as a primary author?
Yeah, well, lead authors are the ones who write the report. In every lead author meeting, we just as a group discuss what the different, for example, outline and of course substance of the chapter would be. My main role was in the adaptation section. So I was responsible for building up the adaptation response to it, the need of incremental transformational adaptation, what are the different adaptation options and their assessment, and the synergies and trade-offs. My role was also assembling one of the boxes, which is cross-chapter box 9, giving adaptation case studies, but I also pitched it into a couple other cross-chapter boxes. And then also within, both the mitigation and adaptation sub-teams, we developed a series of case studies and, just highlighting different examples or enabling conditions and how they're applied. So like in the case of adaptation, we focused on indigenous knowledge with one of my colleagues and then on integrated watershed management and how these topics have been worked in different regions or transboundary watersheds throughout the world.
Okay, and I definitely will want to dig in a little bit on the specifics, but one thing I was curious about is how was the process collaborating with such a diverse group of people who I assume are based all over the world?
Yeah, it was. Well, it was very exciting. When writing and doing your own research, you always read of all these other people, but to actually get to meet with them and have discussions with them was really, really nice. It was very productive. It was special. But it was also challenging in that, as you mentioned, everybody's in a different time zone. So while I was having calls like at 6 a.m, somebody else was having them at 10 at night. It was a challenge either for me to have it earlier or for somebody else to have it later in the day. But we were able to get it done. We were having weekly chapter calls. Almost everybody compromised. There were 4 lead author meetings in Brazil, the UK, Sweden, and Botswana. So they are week-long writing sessions in which we discuss cross-chapter issues with other chapters, but also spend a lot of time working on our own chapter, responding to comments, looking at what the different issues are, new literature that has come up. So it's been a very long, intense process. And, looking back at, for example, our first draft and looking at the final product is it looks quite different, but it all evolved from there.
And how does this compare to one of the larger reports that the IPCC puts out every 4 or 5 years or so?
Well, this one was shorter. Well, several reasons. One of them is that it was specifically requested by the Paris Agreement under the UNFCCC, and that it's going to feed into the COP24 agenda. So it had to be completed by then.
So this really was a special report, not just like in name, but it actually was very different from what the IPCC has commissioned in the past.
Well, it's special for several reasons. One of them is because the three working groups work together for the first time. Usually, you have the assessment reports for working group 1, which is the science, 2, which is impacts vulnerability, and 3, which is for mitigation. So for this special report, the three working groups came together. And then the other reason is that it's the first time that IPCC does a report that was requested in this manner, part of the Paris Agreement. So it is special, not just because of the name of special report. And
where did the 1.5 degrees C come from? Because it seems like 2 degrees C was always the big number for decades now. What prompted people to really start looking at a lower number?
In the negotiations at COP21 in Paris, you correctly mentioned 2 degrees C was the consideration, but then vulnerable countries, island nations, were arguing that at 2 degrees, some of their nations would disappear, that a lot of people would be put at increased risk, and that, in these places, 2 degrees was not safe for them anymore, and that 1.5 would be more of the safeguard than 2, because at 2, most of their populations would still be in considerable danger, which is why the final language of the Paris Agreement mentioned there will be efforts to limit the temperature increase to 2 degrees while making efforts to achieve the 1.5. That's the reason why then the question came of, is 1.5 really possible? Are we at 1.5? How close are we to 1.5? And if 1.5 is possible, then what do we need to achieve it? How are we going to get there?
On that front, I've heard this line parroted a handful of times, that we only have 12 years to completely change our energy system and stop emitting carbon dioxide. Do you know where that number comes from? Because I don't feel like I saw that highlighted in the report. And what really should we be focused on?
The pathways are shown in Chapter 2. So there are 4 different chapters presented, P1, P2, P3, and P4. P1 is like the one where we do the most immediate changes of decarbonizing around 45% by 2030 and then have net zero by 2050. This scenario doesn't have an overshoot, which is the good news. Because, of course, there are other of the pathways do include an overshoot, in which, of course, you later come back down to 1.5. But in the case of adaptation, once you have an overshoot, you face the problem of limits to adaptation. At that point, with overshoots, some systems would be too damaged or have irreversible damage or very limited adaptation options. So looking at the different scenarios, path 1 is the one that has the most, societal changes, decreased energy demand, for example. When you see the change in the pathways, then you can see that the more time we take to do this decarbonization and net zero, then the more we will have to depend on AFLU and BECCS.
Okay, and I will want to get into those acronyms there, but could you expand a little bit more about those systems that really could be permanently damaged if we have that overshoot?
So I think the clearest example is going to be on coral reefs. At 2 degrees, they will almost entirely disappear, and with irreversible changes. So just to give you a brief timeline of it, for example, you see that Like back in the 80s, there were no reports of mass coral bleaching. I mean, this is before the 1980s. Then when we were at around 0 0.4 degrees C, then you have a single mass coral bleaching event, but it's isolated. Then in 1998, we're up to 0.C degree, and then you have the first global mass bleaching and mortality event. And then by 1 degree, which is today, we have back-to-back global mass bleaching and mortality events, some of which are irreversible. And that is today at 1 degree. So, of course, between 1.5, there's still the possibility of restoration of some of them, but then by 2 degrees, that won't be possible anymore. And the same thing happens with some terrestrial ecosystems. In Chapter 3, you have the reasons for concern, figure SPM2 of the Summary for Policymakers, and then it's the burning embers one. And you can see that for selected natural, managed, and human systems, that you can see a pronounced difference between 1.5 and 2. So like in corals, it's, you're still at high risk of irreversible damage. But you can see how in some of the ecosystems, like for terrestrial, that between 1.5 and 2, you see an extensive shift of biomes. So then you have a number doubling or tripling in the number of plants, animals, and insects losing over half of their climatically determined geographical ranges.
Sounds a bit terrifying, but of course these are things that are estimates, and hopefully somewhere in the future, not currently, but a lot of the things that we are worried about are things that are happening today. Now, are there other issues that we've already been observing? Like we mentioned sea level rise with some of those low-lying islands really being concerned. Have we been able to measure that or other effects on biomes?
Yes, and so it's on sea level rise, also in impacts in the Arctic, when we're talking about glaciers melting and the permafrost. But we're also seeing that not all impacts are negatives. There are a couple positive impacts, especially when we're talking about the biome shift and how you'll be able to grow some crops where before you couldn't. We also looked at how global warming impacts human health and how in some cases, for example, there's going to be reduced deaths due to cold. Of course, that will also mean that in some regions there will be increased mortality due to extreme heat, depending on where in the world you are. So, for example, in Southern Europe and Southeast Asia, you will see an increase in heat deaths. But, for example, in North America or in Southern Europe, you would see a decrease in mortality due to extreme cold.
So maybe it is useful to think about this really as a change and not necessarily just as 100% bad. Like possibly we could start seeing more farming expanding into Canada or Siberia, places that previously were just too harsh.
Yes. What we actually have to look at, which is what Chapter 4 brings us to, is what that global response is and how we need to implement a mix of mitigation and adaptation options to achieve the 1.5 in a number of systems: energy, agriculture, land, forests, urban, industry. That there needs to be a large-scale, far-reaching, very accelerated implementation of this.
And how do you see that change coming about?
In some cases, we already have existing technology. In others, there still needs to be more innovation. For some technology, especially like CDR, there needs to be newer technologies. But in general, like we already have the technologies for electric vehicles and energy storage and renewable energy. But it's not just about the technologies and the innovation. It's also about how these are implemented, where the institutions are and the governance of, just governance in general, how we're going to work across scales, at national, subnational, non-state actors, even at the communal level, which is something very important, especially in the case of adaptation, since impacts are felt at local levels.
How do you see that cooperation taking place? I know a lot of people are very wary of handing more power to national or even supranational entities. Do you think that such a change can happen quickly enough, putting the onus on communities, on cities, or even on non-state actors?
The change is possible. I think something that we're seeing, for example, right now in the U.S. is, with the movement we're still in, gives a really good example of that because, the moment the U.S. government announces its withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, then you have this other enormous parallel movement in which you see new commitments from cities and states and universities and financial entities and private sector on how they're going to achieve the Paris goal. So then, in this specific case, you can see how different actors from all sectors have gotten involved. In other countries, the NDC process has included, for example, indigenous populations and municipalities in the development of their commitments. And this is, again, especially important in the case of adaptation to better understand what the local needs are. So there are examples of where it has happened. The involvement of local communities that hadn't occurred in the past is quite empowering to some groups.
Yeah, I think that's definitely very hopeful to see. I know my hometown of Fort Collins has recently set a goal of reaching 100% renewable energy for the city by 2030. One of the most aggressive plans in the world, which is really inspiring, but it really is a problem of scale, and I think that is really highlighted by, you noted CDR and BECCS as well, technologies that haven't really been deployed at a large scale. And just for those who aren't familiar, CDR being carbon dioxide removal, and that being a more general term of BECCS, was it bioenergy, carbon capture, and storage? What are your opinions on the technologies that we have in this space, and where do you think we'll be headed in the future?
Well, as I mentioned, the longer we take to decarbonize and achieve net zero, the more we will have to rely on these options. Chapter 4 assessed the feasibility of them across several of the dimensions: economic, social, institutional, technological, social-cultural, and geophysical. In Chapter 4, you can see the different feasibility assessments of them, but of course we cannot talk about the political will of them. And as you rightly say, some of these options have some concern in that we don't understand the full impacts of implementing them to such a scale.
Notice that the report specifically refrains from using the word geoengineering. I think it's mentioned once, just to mention that you will not be using that term. There was some discussion about SRM, or solar radiation modification. Is this something that the IPCC thinks would be necessary or even possible?
SRM was included in the first place because it was in our mandated outline. So just like the plenary approves of the SPM, the plenary also approves of the outline of what exactly we're going to be writing about. So, the assessment of SRM as an option was done at the specific request of the countries. But even then, and you can see there's a special box on SRM, it also indicates what are the different moral considerations of its implementation. But also, again, that just like with some of the other options, we don't know the full impacts of the implementation at the scale in which it would be needed.
One topic that I noticed was actually not heavily addressed was population. I saw that there were a few things noting population estimates and where we might be headed, but it seemed like for the 1.5 degrees C viable pathways that we would need to see a future in which human population really slows and then turns around. Was that something that was considered at all in the mitigation or adaptation thoughts?
No, I think the main consideration in terms of population was the expected migration of population from rural to urban areas. So we'd be expecting to see about 70% of the population being urban-based. The main point on population was that cities would need to be prepared for that, but also one of the options assessed was the one of migration. But there isn't too much literature out there right now, so there isn't much evidence talking about migration.
And you're speaking just of migration from rural to urban areas?
No, just in general. There's literature indicating that, there's going to be this shift from rural to urban areas, but then also literature talking about like the climate refugees, people that have to move out of their countries or cities and move to other places because, their current homes are uninhabitable. So we looked at both cases, but in the case of climate migration, not the urban rural one, there isn't too much literature out. And as you know, IPCC does an assessment of existing literature, so we don't create any new knowledge. We assess what's already out there.
Seems like an area that might be ripe for researchers who are curious about it.
I mean, we have identified a lot of knowledge gaps, even doing the feasibility assessments, which is where I was most heavily involved. And in chapter 4, we have these matrices of, each option assessed against the 6 feasibility dimensions. And in some of them, we just noted no evidence or limited evidence. And also that, a lot of these, especially again, adaptation options are very context-based because they're local in nature. And that there isn't much literature out there either on these options at regional or national scales. So then all the assessments were done at the global level, keeping in mind that it will vary by region.
Okay, and when you say there's not much evidence or not much research, do you mean like just 1 or 2 studies out there? To you, what makes a solid body of research that you can draw a decent conclusion from?
When we mention limited evidence, it's because we couldn't find more than 2 or 1. And in some cases, there were hundreds or 30 or 40 or 50. So, of course, we cannot write anything, we cannot come to a solid conclusion just based on one publication.
Yeah, absolutely. And what were some of the areas that were really lacking? I mean, we talked about population. What were some of the other areas that need more research that we just don't understand well enough yet?
The application or implementation of mitigation and adaptation options at regional levels. Because we did intend to do the feasibility based on the world regions as defined by UN when we look at the different impacts to climate change in previous ARs and in the previous assessment reports. For some options, there would be a good case across one of the dimensions, but not enough to do a whole robust assessment for each option across the region. So I think that is one of the bigger ones, that for the different options that a country or community might consider, then to look at what else is out there in the region. One thing here I'd like to clarify is that although most of the literature assessed is peer-reviewed, we also looked at gray literature. There was also a consideration for looking at indigenous knowledge. So it isn't just based entirely on peer-reviewed.
Thank you for bringing up that phrase again. I wanted to dig into that. What do you mean by indigenous knowledge?
So just as an example, in the Arctic and here in some Guatemalan, some Mayan communities, indigenous knowledge refers to how indigenous peoples have created a knowledge system on how they've seen impacts. It's just based on mainly their observations and their experiences, so that those considerations should also be taken into account. So, for example, here in Guatemala, there's work, and this is ongoing, on how to mix science data observations on climate impacts with the way that Mayan populations are used to observing of, how they know when to plant and, like the crop schedules. How can they tell the changes by what types of birds they see, for example, and why they aren't seeing them? When we talk about indigenous knowledge as an adaptation option, is actually to use that as an input as well. Work on both types of knowledge together. Because at the end, local people know better of their impacts. And with indigenous knowledge, there is a greater base and background to it that we also need to understand how it works. And I mean, other people have been using it, right? The indigenous populations.
And that brings up an interesting point and something that we were speaking out a little bit before we started recording, that we often stress that climate is long-term, whereas weather is short-term, yet we only have so much time for observations, and even our observations at best can go back a couple hundred years. What would you say to people who insist that, well, we only have this small snapshot, and how can we really understand how the climate has been changing over these thousands of years, and how can we really estimate what's going to happen in the future when we only have this small window of observation?
A lot of data has been obtained through the different ice cores, but also more recently, there's a growing field of science called attribution, in which we can model the different trajectories and see if a specific event can be attributed directly to climate change. So here you separate what is anthropogenic emissions from natural forces. I think one of my colleagues was talking about how when we started this process of the 1.5C report, there was the eruption of a volcano in Indonesia, and how that might affect the current readings, and if that would have any effect on the results of this report. What happens in attribution, you have your emissions, your natural forces emissions, and then your anthropogenic ones. And then when you take one out, you see if such an event could have been attributed to the natural one or to the anthropogenic one. So that is a growing field, and in the future it will be strengthened. We would be better able to tell if a specific event was caused because of anthropogenic emissions.
Wow, I know a lot of people have been very resistant to that, of trying to claim that a certain hurricane or storm or drought was directly caused by climate change, but it sounds like there's growing science to show that that might be the case.
Yes, there is. I know there's a group of researchers in the University of Oxford that are doing this, and others. I mean, the time to question the time frames of, Earth has been here for a million years and such, I think that has been addressed in previous reports. And right now we're looking at, okay, we know about 1.5, we know the role that anthropogenic emissions have played, and now it's up to us to choose. I think one of the very important findings is that, we are currently at 1 degree warming from pre-industrial levels, but that previous emissions do not commit us to a 1.5 C path. So that means that the decisions we take today are going to be very important. Past emissions do not commit us to 1.5, so it's very important to note that the decisions we take today will define what pathway we will be following and what technologies, how much of CDR, for example, we will need to use.
Yes, and that was one thing that actually surprised me a little bit, that we are not already committed to 1.5 degrees C warming, but of course that would assume that we basically revolutionize our entire civilization immediately. The transition pathway proposed is quite aggressive. So I suppose just what's your opinion on this path forward, and how likely do you see us being able to get to our necessary goals?
I think that the report gives hope in that it's still possible to achieve 1.5, although the window is very short, and that we need to take this far-reaching, accelerated pace that has not been seen in the past. As to how likely it is, the report looks at it in terms of physically, it is possible to do it. Within the laws of physics and chemistry, it is possible. But what the IPCC cannot do is assess how people will act upon it, how governments will act. So that's upon everybody to do. We're basically saying these options within the realm of physical sciences are possible.
The human element is always the one that we can't quite predict.
Exactly.
The IPCC has been warning us of this for a long time now, and the change has still been slow.
But one point of courage here is that, for example, we have under our enabling conditions is behavioral change. And not only change, but The report also points out that the role of individuals and communities is very important. So what each of us do as individuals, with our neighbors, church, school, communities in general, is going to be very important to achieve 1.5. So right now, it's not the point to say, oh, it's up to governments and my government doesn't do anything, or the state or the utility company or whatever. Right now we're really talking about collective action. And I think it's also very important to note that each and every one of us has an important role to play.
I think that's maybe the biggest takeaway of all this, that we are all involved in this. So just to wrap things up, what would you tell our listeners of what they could do in their aspect of this response?
I think there's a range of options, starting with, like energy efficiency. What our current energy demand is and how that can be reduced. Of course, there's always the recommendation of water reuse and recycling, how we use our resources, not to be wasteful. But also in just spreading the word, talking with our elected officers, for example. I know that in the US there's this big movement of getting the vote out and talking about climate change. There's also changes in behavior. I mean, you see there's a lot of articles coming out, news articles on how the whole discourse of climate change has changed in North Carolina after Hurricanes Florence and Michael. And I think this is also, for young professionals that are still looking for a career, I'd say that something in climate change is always open. There's a lot of knowledge gaps that need to be filled. I think it's important for, in order for people to want to do something, is that there needs to be an understanding of what the problem is and why something needs to be done. If this understanding isn't there, it's like, well, why should I care, or what can I do? But I think that hopefully with this report, that type of awareness will grow in seeing, the magnitude of the problem. I think what I've always found useful, and not just in the case of climate change, but also in, rural electrification or in talking when people are vulnerable, is to give case-specific examples of how it affects each of us. When you can't get to your job, to your office, because, there's this big flood, or because a mountainside collapse, or because the bridge is damaged, and, how it affects the economy, how it affects your income or your diet. Keeping these things in mind, there's also this recommendation of let's eat less meat because of the enormous amount of emissions. It's also important to point out that no one single option is going to get us to 1.5, but it's a mix. So, of course, like when I say, for example, consume less meat, I also realize that in some rural areas that meat is part of their livelihood more than diet. So, of course, we're not talking about this blanket ban on meat, but because, of course, we have to look into each context. But there's a lot of civil groups and grassroots movements out there. And yeah, again, hopefully this report with the summary for policymakers will help increase this awareness to create more movement and action.
Great. Thank you for the advice, and we all thank you very much for your hard work in putting together this very comprehensive report. I will dig up some links about the stuff that we talked about and share with those who are interested, who can learn more about how they can contribute to this growing body of knowledge and contribute their voice to the conversation. But thank you for coming on and sharing your thoughts and sharing a little bit more about what you've been working on.
Yeah, well, thank you again for the invitation. And if it's still not too late to add what I recommend each individual to do, it's also that, within whatever line of work you have, whatever your work is, to look at what the potential impacts will be and how to start planning for them. So say if you're an engineer, including working with renewable energy, that you need to keep in mind what are going to be the impacts at 1.5. That probably 10 years ago, you might have considered building something in a coastal area for a Hurricane 2 category, but right now you would have to consider a 5. So it's that kind of things in which it would affect every single profession and career and work line. How can we prepare to be more resilient?
I think that's some good final words. to close us out. Thank you very much, Debbie. It's been a great experience talking with you, and I hope we stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you.
This has been the Great Climate Debate Podcast. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider following us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find more about Debbie Ley, the IPCC, and all the topics we covered in the podcast description on SoundCloud and YouTube. If you find this issue important, please do share with your friends on whatever social media you prefer. Thanks for listening. I'm Jeffrey DeSena, and this is the Great Climate Debate Podcast.